Hello. This is a photograph that I took in 1978. I was 14 years old and staying in Miami on the way to the Bahamas. And my dad said, "Oh, it's so exciting. We're going to go to Vizcaya by boat." And I knew what Vizcaya was because I'd been there before with him in a taxi, I think. But we arrived by boat. And anyone who's been to Miami and sort of wondered what to do with themselves, this is what to do with yourself, is to go to Vizcaya. Going by boat, I think, is very complicated. And he had a marvellous client in Miami called Dan Paul on the left there, who was a very vigorous lawyer in Miami and had built a fantastic house on Star Island. And my dad had decorated it for him. There's my father on the right. And they're looking excited because they're on the boat arriving at Vizcaya. So this is Vizcaya from the air in the 1930s. It looks a bit different today because the bit in the foreground is now covered by a high school, I think, and various other things. But the rest of it, the garden and the great villa, is still there. And obviously most of that sort of jungle is gone. Here's the man who built it. This is James Deering. So there were two brothers, Charles and James Deering, and their father had an agricultural machinery company making harvesting machines. And in 1880, he'd realized that the terrible problem of harvesting machines that baled up, the harvested crop using wire was that the offcuts of the wire then got left in the fields and cows would eat them and die. So this was a huge problem. So he worked out a new machine using twine instead of wire that would save the cows. And he launched this machine. He sold, 3,000 in the first month or something. He had to put his entire capital into this new venture. And he got so many orders that he had to call both his sons to come and work for him. And so one of them was, the older one was, I think, traveling in Europe or something. And the younger one, James, this guy, was at MIT. And he was halfway through his sort of education, his university at MIT. And Dad said, "Come to Chicago and run the business with me." And so he did. And so from 1880 until 1910, they worked desperately hard and made a colossal fortune. There's one of the machines down the bottom and the enormous factory at the top. Look at it. It's like a town. Anyway, so they became enormously wealthy. And then 1910, they merged with, somebody, their rivals, McCormick, to form International Harvester. And then they sort of bowed out of the management of the business. And so James was left with huge amounts of money and not really knowing quite what to do, and also wasn't terribly healthy. So he thought he'd go to Florida and build himself a villa. And so in, I think, 1912, he and Charles went on a trip to Egypt. And Charles was a bit of an amateur artist, and he'd been a friend of John Singer Sargent in Paris and other people. And he'd studied a bit of painting, as well as being a harvesting machine executive. So on the trip to Egypt, Charles makes this rather nice sort of cartoon with, you see, it says, "The famous architect T, stepping out of his tomb to offer to build Chim's new palace in Florida." And so Chim, being Jim, James, the brother, standing there looking rather surprised, dressed in a sort of Bertie Woodhouse outfit. Anyway, the actual architect, although he wasn't really an architect, is this man, Paul Chalfin. And Paul Chalfin was an assistant of Elsie de Wolfe. Elsie de Wolfe, the famous decorator in New York, she'd gone to Chicago to do James Deering's new house on Lakeshore Drive. And then he slightly exasperated her by wanting her there more than she wanted to be in Chicago. She really just wanted to be in New York. And so she'd sent this Paul Chalfin, assistant of hers, to Chicago, who had promptly arrived and said, "Well, all those chairs that you bought at Marshall Field and they told you were antique, they're all brand new, look at them." And so he managed to get Marshall Field to take them back and give him a refund. And so he was immediately hired. basically for life. And anyway, so here's Chalfin in Florida on the site of Vizcaya. And I love he's got a sort of cummerbund around his waist and a very good hat. And then here's the actual architect, because Chalfin wasn't an architect at all, he was really a decorator. Whereas this is a man called Burrell Hoffman. And where did he come from? He had been an assistant at Carrere and Hastings, and he'd worked in various places, and he'd opened a practice of his own in New York. And so he was hired really by Chalfin to be the sort of, executor architect. And there was frightful rows between them after a bit, and terrible disagreements, with Chalfin saying that Hoffman had basically done the plumbing, but Hoffman actually did do the architecture, but certainly the inspiration and the design were very much Chalfin. Anyway, Chalfin goes down to Florida and gets Deering to buy him this houseboat, frightfully elaborate. I mean, he probably designed it himself, didn't he? But he moors this houseboat at Coconut Grove, just north of the huge piece of land that Deering had bought south of Miami. And Miami was quite a small town in those days, with 10,000 inhabitants or something. And Coconut Grove was a sort of a winter resort. And so he has this houseboat, and so from there he starts building on the land. And so one of the first things they built was a boathouse here, and moored next to the boathouse in the picture you see is the Nepenthe, which was, I suppose that's probably a Greek goddess or something, is it? Nepenthe, I don't know. But this was Deering's yacht for down there. And so he'd take his guests out on fishing expeditions, and he went, and I suppose that would collect him in Miami and then take him down by water. And he arrived on Christmas Day 1916, bought the land in 1912, and so on Christmas Day 1916 arrived to stay in the completed Vizcaya. Oh, and this is the ashtray and matchbox holder in silver from the Nepenthe, which seems to have it's got a face of Bacchus on the matchbox holder. Beautiful thing. Anyway, here is the finished villa, I think photographed in 1916. And isn't it fantastic? So it's a sort of Italian Renaissance villa with some sort of, elaborating bits with pediments on the inside and volutes and all sorts of fancy stuff added, and right on the water, and the entire thing built of concrete in a very, very sort of sophisticated, very modern way, and incredibly quickly built. And here's today. So the coloured photographs are all mine, because I've been there quite a few times since 1978. I absolutely love the place. And there's a sort of stone barge in front of the house, which is in theory was a breakwater, and I think it was a place where, I was always told that he used to have an orchestra playing on there when he'd give parties. And there it is. And all the carving, all the sculptures were done by a man called Sterling Calder, who was actually the father of Alexander Calder, who was that famous sculptor in the 60s making those mobiles. So Sterling Calder. And here's the barge back in the day. This is in, I think, the 30s. And it's covered in planting, do you see? It must have been extraordinary. Isn't that beautiful? And then there's a couple of sort of, extensions, arms going out to the sides, wrapping around that stone barge, and one has this little sort of pavilion on the end of it, which is rather pretty. It's a sort of bit like a Viennese sort of tea pavilion from 1900. And then there were quite a lot of gondolas. It was quite a thing of sort of, let's make it Venice. And then the gondola poles, do you see that striped pole? And then there's the pavilion now. And now let's go inside the house. So this is sort of where you enter now. As you go in, there's a big courtyard which now has been made into an atrium. They've put a glass roof on it, which is unfortunate, but I suppose necessary. And of course, they get terrible damage from hurricanes all the time, so they need that kind of protection. But here in that entryway, there's a marvelous sort of a Roman bath or something, and some sculptures. And Chalfin and Deering had gone travelling around Italy and Spain, I think, and buying up endless stuff. And there was a warehouse in New York that was gradually filled with the enormous amounts of stuff that they bought. And in the warehouse, Chalfin would go to the warehouse and would set up panelled rooms that they'd bought and set them up in the warehouse so that then Deering could go and have a look at the possible room. And then poor Mr. Burrell Hoffman had to include these rooms in his architectural plan. Frightfully complicated and difficult. Anyway, there's a picture from 1916 of that same bath in the courtyard. And you see there used to be all these curtains everywhere to try and keep it cool. And then you hear more today with a lot of planting. And then here, again, 1916, you can see more curtains there. And then upstairs, there's a sort of gallery going around, connecting bedrooms and breakfast room and things together. But isn't it wonderful? And today, again, and this is just one of the antique fragments that they brought back. And it's so marvellous to see these old things surrounded by orchids and sort of mad planting. Don't often see it. And then this, what is this? It's a sort of a fountain, or is it a bird bath originally? But it sort of looks like it might be, what's that man called? Saint-Gaudens or something. It was a sculptor in New York at that time, and was a friend of Charles, the brother. So maybe it's by him, I don't know. And then this is the entrance hall, which has got rather fantastic directoire, grisaille wallpaper, which I think is original, is old, and obviously hasn't fared terribly well. And so now they keep it very dark, and though you can't really take a photograph. So there's an old one. This is Deering's study, and there's a Roman mosaic. Is it real or is it 19th century? Don't know. Over the fireplace there, and I think that painting maybe is William Deering, the father. And then here, the big living room, looking terribly sort of cosy and inviting and nice, which it doesn't really any longer. It looks a bit mad. But here it is now, and it's got this fantastic, huge sort of Renaissance fireplace. That where that came from, I don't know, but I suppose it's probably Italian. And it's probably actually cobbled together from different bits and pieces, and part of it is brand new in 1910, but who knows? But it is rather beautiful, isn't it? It looks sort of 1580 or something. And then a fantastic wooden ceiling that probably also came from Italy. And all these old bits and pieces that they bought and filled that warehouse, imagine. That's a rather nice Renaissance chair. Here's some more furniture. And then here the dining room. And it's just absolutely wonderful, I think, and so mad. And here's the dining room sideboard, which is clearly, an old church fitting, I think, isn't it, from Italy, or it's something from a sacristy in an Italian church, but then cobbled together with different bits. So we've got some Gothic bits inserted, but then that frieze and the end panel, they look like they're about sort of 1510 or something, in Dacia, marquetry. Fascinating. And then this is one of the lodges, furnished with some wicker originally, looking very cosy and nice and comfortable, doesn't it? And then today, no furniture, empty, but still looking rather wonderful and rather amazing. Doors, there's a detail of that door with some cast bronze detail, sort of, a 1912 or whenever it's made interpretation of Renaissance things. Love that. And then here, I rather love that detail with a bust in front of, there's a sort of a vent behind, and whether that was for air or for light, not sure, but there's a corridor behind there, and I think a little bit of light comes through there. It's rather a wonderful detail. And then here, a little sitting room with very pretty furniture and rather wonderful silk on the walls that I think they had woven, copying an 18th century one. But look at all this stuff. Isn't it marvellous? Imagine that sitting in Miami. It is extraordinary. It's really worth going to see. It can be terribly busy if you go. I was there on a Saturday or something, and my God, it was crowded. But still, it's so, so beautiful. And of course, most people going are not really very interested, so they rush through. So you can linger. And there's a fantastic sort of 1710 or something, Scagliola tabletop, a bit faded, but isn't that beautiful? And there's the little telephone cubicle, which is quite odd because they actually had the first telephone system in Miami, and they had an operatorless system that you could call from one room to another. So I don't know why, maybe that was just for guests, or maybe it's been left there. I suppose it was for visitors. Anyway, this is what is described as the tea room. It's rather lovely. And now, most beautiful rooms. And they're all just a sort of mishmash with bits of, that's a sort of a Renaissance or, imitation Renaissance fireplace, and then sort of 1790 or something Italian neoclassical decoration around it, and then a couple of gondola lights flanking it. It's all just slightly mad. And then going upstairs, here we are, and so this is the sort of gallery wrapping around three sides of the next floor up, and then looking down from there into the courtyard, which is so pretty. And then up there's all sorts of treasures and sort of painted benches from, I suppose, from Venice probably, and a big Chinese porcelain dog. And then here, this was the breakfast room, which was upstairs, which is rather wonderful. And there are wrought iron gates opening into it, and then these wonderful paintings, which must have, I think they came from some house in Europe. They bought them and then fitted them into here. And poor Mr. Burrell Hoffman obviously had a terrible time making that room exactly the right size for those paintings. But maybe not, maybe they were made for the room. But they are rather fantastic. And the fireplace, I think, is wonderful. And those stools are very nice as well. And then here, this is that same room, and that entire wall, the glass doors disappear back into the walls, I think. It opens up completely, and you can see there's a balcony outside. There it is on the top left there. So that must have been, imagine having breakfast there, wouldn't that be wonderful? Really lovely. And I think the loggia we saw before is that space below it, and so, which obviously wasn't I think glazed originally. And then this is James Deering's sort of sitting room, private sitting room upstairs on that same floor as the breakfast room, which is again a sort of Italian 1790s neoclassical style, and whether, I imagine some of the panelling is old, they got from somewhere, and that fireplace supposedly comes from a house in Ireland called Rathfernham Castle or something, and where William Chambers worked, and I think it looks like it could be William Chambers' So that's, it's full of all these sort of treasures. And then this is his bedroom next door, and a tiny little single bed. He clearly did not like to sleep with anybody else, but we will see he had an arrangement. And the bed is I think an old sort of Empire bed, Italian I suppose, Empire bed with this gilded brass frieze. Look at that, isn't that beautiful? And then this embroidered sort of counterpane that he's had made. I mean, it's so incredible, the workmanship. And this looking from the bed, and the open door goes through to his bathroom, and then the other door goes to a little loggia sort of balcony thing. And here is that bathroom, which is the central room on that side of the house. And isn't that fantastic? So a tented embroidered silk ceiling, and then all these white marble, edged in dark marble. There's the wash basin. There's a detail of the marble and these silvered metal motifs in the panels, and it's just divine. Look at that embroidery on the tenting. So pretty. And then the bath, and the bath was piped for hot and cold fresh water and hot and cold seawater. Quite luxurious. And then in the central window is sadly I haven't got a proper picture of it, but his sort of wash basin shaving stand, and so he could stand there and shave and watch guests arriving by boat from Miami. That's the idea, although I think quite a lot of them just came in a motor car. But here, that is the loggia balcony behind, you see, the bathroom. And from outside. And then here is the plan of that floor. And you see it's signed by Burrell Hoffman Jr. and Paul Chalfin, associate architects, in the good old days before Mr. Chalfin started saying that Mr. Hoffman had just done the plumbing. But you can see on this plan, the courtyard in the middle, the sea is up to the top of the plan. On the right is that breakfast room in the centre, and then Deering's suite is top left, so there's his salon, it says, and then his bedroom, and then his bathroom facing the gallery, and then the little loggia, and the loggia has a second door going through to another guest room. So this was obviously cunningly arranged so that Mr. Deering could have a nighttime visitor, or a nighttime visit, I suppose, because that bed of his wasn't going to accommodate two people. And who was the nighttime visitor? And one always slightly wonders whether it wasn't Mr. Chalfin, but it doesn't seem to have been. Apparently their letters were terribly sort of formal, although they did do quite a lot of travelling together. So it does slightly make one wonder. But then there's quite a lot. I think Mr. Chalfin said that Mr. Deering had a mistress of some sort. But who knows? Anyway, and actually the room next door is quite feminine. So, then again, Mr. Chalfin's cummerbund was quite feminine. Anyway, this is the room next door, the guest room next door, and that corner is where the door, the jib door, hidden in the panelling, goes through to that loggia and then to Mr. Deering's bedroom. And so presumably James would pop in here. And there's the bed. It's a very feminine bed, isn't it? It's very pretty. Presumably he had a lady friend. Anyway, then there are other guest rooms up little staircases, and the whole place is full of that Florida coral stone, which is so pretty. It's sort of like travertine. Here's one of the other bedrooms with a lovely sort of 1830s Italian bed, and a similar period little secretaire. And look at that beautiful kind of, I suppose it's really a soup tureen on top, isn't it? But it's very pretty. And this is the best bedroom of all. Look at that, isn't that wonderful? And the bedrooms were all given names by Chalfin. And this one I think was called Cathay. So it's a very, all chinoiserie. It could be the Brighton Pavilion, couldn't it? Isn't it lovely? Look at that bed. There's a detail at the top of the bed. Isn't that divine? And then what about those lamps? Look at the lamps. Love that room. So pretty. And then you're probably thinking, what about a swimming pool? I mean, it's in Florida, so obviously there is a swimming pool. So this is the side of the house that, if we could see to the left, we'd see the sea. So, this is round the corner from from the front, and you see those two arches on the left. Those you can sort of see they're reflected in water. That is the swimming pool, and so the swimming pool went into the house, which you've got to admit that's pretty chic. And in fact, of course, Mr. Deering, who wasn't terribly mobile already, he was anemic. He had chronic anemia, and so he was not feeling terribly well. And so he had a Otis put in an elevator, which must have been one of the first elevators in Florida, probably, in 1912, imagine. And so the elevator took him straight down to the basement, so he could then wander along into the swimming pool. So there's a swimming pool today, looking a bit forlorn without any water, but you do see that you could swim in and out, which is rather marvellous. And there are the steps going up into the sort of landing place, and I suppose that there was a door there in that arch, which has been blocked up, so there were doors. And then here it is a few years ago I found in a book filled with water, and you can see that the completely mad ceiling, which was painted and sort of stucco decorated and decorated with shells and things by a very odd man called Robert Winthrop Chandler, who was a sort of a relative of the Astors, I think, and from New York, and was terribly rich and very artistic, and made the mistake of marrying an Italian opera singer called Lina Cavalieri, and yeah, he made a prenuptial agreement with her, and presumably she had no money and he had lots of money, and the prenuptial agreement said, basically you can have everything. He must have been very much in love. I think she was very beautiful. Anyway, 18 months later she divorced him and she got everything, and so he had to go around painting everything for everybody. So he did quite a lot of work for Gertrude Vanderbilt. He made her studio fireplace with the flames coming out of it, if you know that. But here he did the ceiling. And here it is originally, properly full of water, and then with ropes on the, making a sort of balustrade to go down. And you can sort of see there are fish in the ceiling and all sorts of, it is a wonderful thing there. Imagine swimming in and out. There's one of the borders of the ceiling, and I think his signature is there somewhere, but we can't read it. Obviously, the picture's too small. And then this is looking back at the house. So looking at, you can see that's where the breakfast room is above, from the garden, which is incredibly elaborate and enormous, and it's wonderful to go and visit. And absolutely, like all, proper Renaissance gardens, any sort of gardens really, should be. It's full of people enjoying themselves, lots of people. Unfortunately, of course, the people today don't look quite as attractive as they might have done, in one of the Italian Renaissance gardens that it's modelled on. So you do get quite a lot of, the present-day population of Miami taking pictures of each other and of themselves everywhere. So it's quite difficult to get nice pictures of it. Also, honestly, this would just go on forever if I showed you all the pictures of the garden, wouldn't it? But I think when I was there taking these pictures, I think there was a Russian wedding going on immediately behind me. It was there's a lot. Anyway, there's a couple of sphinxes, and it's also wonderful because it's all this classical garden with then palms everywhere, and all these wonderful trees. Look at all this. It's the most beautiful place, and then a lizard on top of a 18th century Italian sort of sculpture. And then there's this hilarious sort of little pavilion at the end of the garden, which is really very beautiful. And it's clearly frescoed inside, and of course one's not allowed to go in it. And I rather think the Russians were getting married in front of it, and so they'd sort of taped off the area and were very busy filming themselves. But isn't that fascinating, that painted ceiling? Long to go in there. And then underneath, there's this wonderful sort of coral mask of somebody over a gate. It's just the most beautiful place. Now this is John Singer Sargent visiting Florida in 1917, and he went down to do a portrait of a Rockefeller. I think John D. Rockefeller. He had to do a portrait of him, and he was going a bit nuts because he longed to be in Europe, and 1917 obviously wasn't the easiest time to travel in Europe, and so he was stuck in America and stuck in Florida, and he wasn't mad keen on Florida. So he went down to see his old friend, Charles Deering, the older brother of James, who had a place of his own about 6 miles north of James's, of Vizcaya. And so he did this portrait of his friend Charles sitting in a wicker chair on a beach, and then went to see James and Vizcaya, which was just finished, or just not even quite finished. So he did this watercolor of James in his white suit. And then here's the barge, you see, on the left, and there's a sort of a hut over it, which is protecting, I think, Mr. Calder doing his carvings. So it's that early on. And then Sargent did not approve of the striped gondola poles and the coloured gondola poles, and so he left them white in his watercolour. And then there was a rifle argument between, I think Deering thought they looked much better like that, and so told Chalfin, and Chalfin was rightfully offended. And then here's the courtyard, all furnished and not glazed, and no people around. Isn't it wonderful? Imagine what a dream. And then one of those lodges with all the original curtains. Beautiful. It's such a beautiful place. If you're ever stuck in Miami and want something to do, go there. It's an absolute dream.